their heart. They can't feel any pain in their heart. In other words, they don't feel the pain of sin in their own lives. And so he says it's like having this callus over their hearts. They literally feel nothing. In fact, look at verse 19. Paul says, having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality. Or literally what Paul's talking about here is these Gentiles have given themselves over to every form of sexual indulgence. Now it's getting a little uncomfortable, isn't it? So that's all I'm going to say about that, because I want to keep this sermon G-rated here, okay? But what we need to understand is that even though Paul says these Gentiles are giving themselves over to this stuff, he also tells us that they can't get enough of it. Because let's go on. He says, having lost all sensitivity, they've given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. And he's talking about the greed of sin here. And so he says they can't get enough of this stuff. And so Paul says, as Jesus followers, he says you're not like them, you're to be different. And all of that begins right here, right? It begins in the heart. Like if we really want to be different, then it begins with our character, and it begins with our heart, because the heart is the center of our character. The heart is the center and the source of all of our loyalties. All of our loyalty to God is found right here. This is where it begins. And what we need to understand is that it needs to be an intentional decision. Like if we want to live with this different character, then it has to be this intentional decision that we're going to allow Jesus to change us from the inside out. It's not something that just accidentally happens. You know, I've been preaching for the better part of 25 years now. So over that course of time, a lot of sermons that I've preached. And every once in a while in a sermon, I'll say something that comes out the wrong way, right? Like I say it in a way I didn't mean to say it. Like I remember several years ago, when I was on staff at a church in Indiana, I was the teaching pastor there. And so I preached about 15, 20 Sundays a year. And I was telling this story about how I didn't kiss my wife on New Year's Eve heading into the New Year, which evidently is a big deal because it really upset her that I didn't do that. And we were with a bunch of friends. We were at this party with a bunch of friends. And so what I meant to say, as I was telling the story, what I meant to say was all the guys that we were with got up and went over and kissed their wives at midnight. But what I said was all the guys that we were with got up and went over and kissed my wife at midnight. Now that kind of changes the story just a little bit, doesn't it? So I had a guy come up to me after the service. He's like, hey, I don't know if you realize what you said when you were telling that story about, you not kissing your wife at midnight. My wife had a lot of questions to answer after that particular service, right? Because it just changes the whole story. But I didn't even realize that I'd said it. I just went on like I had told the story the way that I wanted to tell it. Now here's my point. Sometimes we do things without even thinking, don't we? Sometimes there are things that happen by accident. Now listen, friends, we don't get accidentally changed by Jesus. It doesn't happen that way. If we leave it up to an accident, it's never going to happen. We'll live the way that the world lives, and we'll never be different. You see, this world that we're living in, it's going one way. And there was this time when we were living the way that the world wanted us to live, and we were going the same direction that the world was going. But then we had this moment where we decided that we wanted to follow Jesus, right? Like we decided we were no longer going to live for ourselves, but now we wanted to live for Jesus. And so that was this intentional decision that we made. And so we got into this relationship with Jesus, and he set us going the right direction, the right way, going in a different direction than the rest of the world, right? Because we wanted to follow him, and we wanted to live for him, and that wasn't an accident. So we made this intentional decision to walk in a different way than the rest of the world. But as we make this intentional decision, we have to continue to make this intentional decision that we want to be different, that we want to change from the inside out, that we want to have this different character. Look at what John says here. He says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. John says, don't love the world. And so if we're going to be different, and we're going to have a different character, and it's going to start on the inside, then rather than loving the world, we have to be intentional about loving Jesus. And when we're intentional about loving Jesus, then our character begins to change, and that's what makes us different. Now here in just a moment, we're going to end this message, and we're going to kind of go through a list really quick that Paul's going to give us that kind of shows us this different character that we need to have, how we can be different, all right? But we live with a different character because we're intentional about Jesus changing us from the inside out. And so we have a different character. Paul also says that we're different because we're a different creation. We're a different creation. What Paul's about to tell us here is that we should get rid of the things that characterize us, and we should hold on to the things that characterize Jesus. Go back to verse 20. I think you'll see what Paul's talking about here. Look at what he says. He says, that, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. So you hear this contrast now that Paul's going to start to give, right? I mean, this is when he starts to tell us that we're different. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God, in true righteousness and holiness. Now, there's a lot that Paul's packed in here in just these 4 or 5 verses. But Paul's point here is that we're to be different, because when we decide to follow Jesus, we are to put off the old self. He says that we're to get rid of the old self and all those old desires that we had that just continue to lie to us. And what Paul's literally talking about here is he's talking about, if you take a look at it in the original language, he's literally talking about like what you do when you change clothes. Like a little bit later on this afternoon, I'm going to go home and I'm going to change clothes, right? But I'm not going to grab a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and put those on over the clothes that I'm wearing right now. That would be kind of silly, wouldn't it? And so this is what Paul's saying. He says you literally have to take off the old self, and then you've got to put on the new self. And Paul says you've got to take off the old self because the old self isn't very good. He says the old self is being corrupted by these deceitful desires. If you look in the original language, these deceitful desires that Paul's talking about, he's talking about sin. And so he says you've got to take off the old self because the old self is being corrupted by sin. Now, I looked at that word that Paul uses there for corrupt. Excuse me. Thanks for sticking with me the last couple of weeks. But I looked at this word that Paul uses in the original language when he uses the word corrupt, when Paul says that the old self's being corrupted by sin. And when you take a look at that word, you discover it's a word that's got this root word that something is being destroyed. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second now, because that changes really the whole picture of the verse, doesn't it? Because oftentimes you can think, well, okay, so the old self's being corrupted by sin, so it's almost like the old self is being tainted by sin, or there's like this, like sin's being mixed in, some bad stuff with the good stuff. No, Paul says the old self's being destroyed. Bottom line, that's it. The old self is being destroyed by sin. And so Paul says you've got to take off the old self and you've got to put on the new self. You've got to be a different creation because of Jesus. It kind of reminds me of what Paul says in Romans 12. Many of you, I know, have heard this verse and have heard it over and over. But he talks about being a new creation. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so what Paul says here, he says, when you make this intentional decision that we just talked about, you make this intentional decision to follow Jesus, you can't fall back into your old sinful habits.